Thanks, Terry. Thanks, Walter.
Next.
Thanks, Kieran.
So
Next.
this is next, that's previous.
Okay, next is that one. Okay. Should I fine? Okay. So I think the tryptophan from the turkey sandwich is starting to wear off. And we're continuing with the theme here. Constellations in the Catskills, or constellations in the Catskills. And of course, Linda Zimmerman mentioned the Pleiades as one of the constellations that she's studied. And we just heard about Orion, or the Wintermaker, from Michael. But there are others as well that are being researched that I want to bring up. And I hope everybody can hear me okay. So this is actually the location of some of the sites that are being researched. And what I want to mention is, the theme of as above, so below. We can find evidence of esoteric alignments between the sky and the earth and stone constructions on the ground that may mirror constellations in the night sky. And I was made aware of a researcher named Hugh Evans in Great Britain, who's got a book out called The Origin of the Zodiac. And he identified a region of Great Britain known as Snowdonia, which is Winning, and proposed that there were a lot of stone constructions on the ground there that mirrored constellations in the sky, and he laid it out. And that got me thinking, maybe we have a similar situation here in our region. And if you think about it, if you have pre-literate, pre-industrial culture that's sitting around watching the sky at night, looking for patterns and making up stories, why wouldn't they try to express those on the ground with constructions and mirror those patterns of constellations in the sky? Now, we're going to start with the late researcher, Craig Wright, who passed away within the past 6 months, I believe, just before the holidays, which was shocking. And he had contacted me in May, about a year ago, that there were these mounds that he's been researching. Now, Polly and I went and looked at a site that Craig had identified along the Mohawk River about a dozen years ago. I want to say we went there. It's very, very interesting and overgrown. But he kept researching, and he found this site, which he's got LiDAR, and he kind of pointed out what he had going on there. And he wrote me and said he identified what he believed was the Pleiades built on land near the Mohawk River, west of Albany in Schenectady County, in the town of Rotterdam. And I'm going to read from Craig's notes. The first LiDAR image is of the site in upstate New York. There are 10 pimples on the landscape that are stone mounds. Each of these mounds are an average of 25 feet in diameter, approximately 5 feet high. I was able to document 5 of the 10 mounds. The remaining ones are inaccessible due to very thick vegetation. I believe they are representing Pleiades constellation and being bisected by the winter solstice orientation. So when he sent this map to me, he didn't really understand what these 3 dots were that are isolated in red. And I suggested maybe he should look and see if they correlated with the winter solstice sunrise. And sure enough, it matched the angle at his latitude. So the second image shows his interpretation of those mounds. And he turned the LiDAR image upside down to match with the photo and labeled Pleiades image with the labeled stars. The black is Pleiades, the red ones possibly in alignment with the winter solstice sunrise. And that could be confirmed through our observation, but he had not gotten that far. So Polly and I, as I mentioned, visited a site in Glenville, which had not been fully investigated. We knew he was onto something. He definitely was onto something. He knew it, we knew it. His untimely passing this past winter was a shock, and I'm glad that this report and his report of the Pleiades discovery was made none too soon. And this discovery should be commended, as should Craig's passion and commitment to uncovering this lost knowledge. He is and he will be missed, and his son posted a very poignant memorial on the near a Google site just after. I mean, that's how I found out. Somebody forwarded to me that he had passed away, and his son had basically said that Near had offered him so much meaning and so much camaraderie through the common affinity of people wanting to figure out what these sites are. So that's a common thread. The next site, of course, we just had a deep dive on, so I don't have to go that far into it, but Michael Madonna's site in the Bly in Ulster County is apparently a representation of Orion, or the Winter Maker. And I'm just going to read again some of Michael's notes that he shared with me, identifying what believed to be Orion, or the Winter Maker constellation, to the indigenous Lenape Indians at this site. In addition to the constellation, there are many other features and alignments that have been documented at the location. And we just learned that many of the features are oriented to celestial north, pointing to Overlook Mountain in nearby Woodstock, and to the Draco constellation petroform construction that is there. And we believe it is potentially pre-contact, and the site at Overlook Mountain has actually been dated through the OSL study that Nira did to the pre-contact period. And one of the mounds that was tested is one of the features that makes up the Draco constellation petroform. So what Michael pointed out is that this is not unique. He compiled quite a bit of research on ground-based Cairn and Barrow star maps globally, especially in North America, the British Isles, and Australia. So per Michael's research, it's fair to say that the idea of regional constellation maps is at least speculatively established in research. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia have proven that one may be the most enlightening cultural basis for their stone and barrow maps. Briefly, most of them intermingle ceremonial wayfinding cardinal points, storytelling, and landscape features, and the Australian tribes, lacking any written language, also used accompanying mnemonic songs, an element of archaeoacoustics. Most interesting, Michael thinks, and for immediate purpose, that Orion on the Tongor site and Draco on the Overlook Mountain site line up almost perfectly relative to the orientation that would be the night sky. In essence, they form a near perfect Ojibwe regional constellation map. Additionally, there's a serpent wall at Tongor that appears to align perfectly with Overlook Mountain, as Michael mentioned. One wall in particular has always been a mystery because it's heavily featured but lacked any obvious orientation until the connection with Overlook Mountain. And it's apparently oriented towards that Overlook Mountain site to the north. Should also be emphasized as we look at Eastern North American tribal traditions relative to naming and identifying constellations. We find that Tongor Brook, the site, has a Winter Maker constellation, which is larger, contains more stars than the Lion. This is also true with the site on Overlook Mountain with Draco. There are more stars that actually make up what we see in the sky as Draco. And this is an image of the Overlook Mountain site, the great cairns that form the Draco effigy. That's a petroglyph on the landscape. The next site is Monument Ridge. Researcher Todd Fletcher, who was the New York State coroner for a little while, has what he believes is the constellation Bootis, with the bright star Arcturus, constructed in stone mounds and walls at Monument Ridge in Fleischmann's, New York, on his property. The site also marks solstice alignments. Todd has shared some of his thoughts, which I'll read from. For starters, Craig has found the site in his area thought to be a representation of Pleiades, as Linda Zimmerman, in her book Mysterious Stone Sites in Hudson Valley of New York and Northern Jersey, has also identified what appears to be Pleiades constellations at the Round Hole Wall, as we just learned. The thought is a site or combinations of sites may singularly or jointly offer land-based constellation maps for a particular regional area, possibly within watersheds. If this is the case, there will be additional locations with Pleiades constructed. And the Pleiades constellation Craig and Linda have identified are stone piles that are spread out, as the Orion constellation that Michael has found, as well as the Draco constellation found on Overlook Mountain. As Todd has been studying the monument-rich site, he's been contemplating the design criteria. Of the four constructions, it appears that Monument 3 will be the representative of the constellation Buddhist, the center of which may be representing the bright star Arcturus. Monument 4, he feels, may represent the constellations of the Solar Triangle. That would be Vega, Deneb, and Altair. Todd has been contemplating the possibility that Monument 1 represents Pleiades. Monument 2, which is positioned between Monument 3, Buddhist, and Monument 1, Pleiades, may represent Ursa Major, although the constellations and the orientations is backwards, which on a star map is located between Buddhist and Pleiades. Each one of these constellations at some point through the year is directly overhead and may represent an epoch and a time of year or season of significance, question mark. According to Todd, there's more research to do on stellarium to identify the times that these orientations were present in the sky. So here's a map of what I mentioned earlier with Hugh Evans and his Ophiuchus of Zodiac, and he discovered that in a 1,500 square mile area, these stars and these representations of constellations were spread out. This isn't that much larger than the area of the Catskills, so you got to kind of wonder if the same type of thing is occurring in our region. And using Draco and Overlook Mountain as a reference point for celestial north, you can, in a sense, project the northern constellations on the ground and create a predictive model for where we think other constellations may be, and then try to correlate those locations with known ceremonial stone landscape locations. And this could reveal that there is some discernible pattern, and of course this work is ongoing. So that takes care of the constellations in the Catskills. And what I'm going to move on to next is, I think I just read that part, yeah. What I call Esoteric America. And Michael touched on some of these points in his talk, but really, the premise of Esoteric America is that there are many worldwide esoteric traditions dating back thousands of years that have been brought forward through time. If we think about the Egyptian mystery schools and up through the Greek and the Roman esoteric traditions, through the medieval and Renaissance, right up to the Masonic and modern age, the common denominator really is archaeoastronomy and mathematics. And I think it's important to point that out. When we think of esoteric alignments, we think of a network or a grid of lines connecting places of importance and certain energy. We may think of ley lines or energy meridians that run across the globe, in some cases forming patterns of structure and symmetry. And many understand that where these lines connect and intersect are considered power centers or vortex structures that focus and enhance natural earth energies, such as telluric energies, if you will. And these forces may be resulting from geomagnetic energy produced by the negatively charged Earth. Earth is negatively charged, coming in contact with the positively charged atmosphere. Our atmosphere is exposed to 25,000 thunderstorms daily, constantly, 24/7. We experienced one here a little bit earlier that was pretty earth-shattering. So where you have a positively charged atmosphere coming in contact with a negatively charged ground, you have a resistance field right at the surface of that Earth. And that resistance field at that point of convergence can actually be measured. Many feel that dolmen and henges have been set up to control, focus, harness, and direct such energy to benefit communities and those who constructed them. And throughout the ages, these locations have been established and mapped, and connecting the dots of these locations reveals a complex and complicated pattern of grids, basically covering the planet. Now, other esoteric traditions are more an expression of the age-old adage, as above, so below, establishing a connection between earth and sky. In my book, Spirits in Stone, there's a chapter on the main streets of Woodstock, which are are said to have a configuration that are both a calendar and a compass. And what I wanted to point out is that, of course, the esoteric tradition of creating cities, New York City, Washington, D.C., all were laid out in a very Masonic tradition or esoteric tradition, lining up things with the heavens. But what I'm finding is that in many small towns, we're finding the same thing. So what we have here is a map of Woodstock, New York, my hometown. You can see there's a line that goes north-south. That's Rock City Road. East-west is the Bearsville Flats and Route 212. And Mill Hill Road runs right here at a perfect angle of 122 degrees. So I had a chapter about this, and it was always very interesting, but I never really understood, where that came from. And I doubted that it was that it was indigenous in origin. So basically, Overlook Mountain Center has a tradition of being on the Woodstock Green on the winter solstice sunrise. And we plan to do that this past 2024. And we all met there on the 20th. And it was a gray morning and it was overcast, so nobody could see the horizon. But thankfully, one person was late and showed up the next day, Elizabeth Fishcroft was here, and she took pictures that morning. And what she showed is that the church steeple before sunrise lit up. Before the sun came above the horizon, that church steeple was transcendently lit up. And I found that fascinating. And a lot of things started to click in my head about who possibly could have laid out this Masonic tradition. And if we look at the date of the church, it was built in 1799, actually rebuilt in 1799. And if we want to dig a little deeper about the history of Woodstock, we have to know about Robert R. Livingston. And actually, Robert R. Livingston is the son of Robert Livingston. So Robert R. is the chancellor. Robert, his father, was known as the judge, and they were the first landholders of Woodstock. They basically purchased all of what is now Woodstock, which also included Phoenicia and Shandaken. It was much, much bigger back then. So they purchased the lands. They established the first grist mill there so that the workers could come in and harvest the wood, hence Woodstock. And Livingston, not this Livingston, but his father was an agent of the king, and he purchased lands from Cornelius Hardenberg, and those lands would become Woodstock. Now, who were the Masons? Robert R. Livingston, it turns out, was a very important Mason. He was the first unified Grand Master of the United States, which means he unified the Pennsylvania, the New York, and the New Jersey Masonic lodges. And at the time, there were hundreds of them. And who were the Masons? They were the bankers, they were the lawyers, they were the merchants, they were the engineers, the politicians. They all were members of the Fraternal Order and Brotherhood of the Freemasons. And in a sense, they were almost like the Chamber of Commerce of the day. If people came to town and wanted to have an introduction to the business people or the politicians, they'd go through the Masonic temple. If they wanted to raise charity or money to build a new church, the Masons were the ones who built churches, going all the way back to the old world. So it started to make sense that the orientation of the church in Woodstock would be mirroring a Masonic tradition. Now, Robert R. Livingston has a much deeper esoteric tradition. He was one of the signers and drafters of the Declaration of Independence, whereas Mr. Thomas Jefferson is credited with drafting, and it was actually drafted by committee, and Livingston was one of those committee members, a committee of 5. And you can start going down some pretty esoteric rabbit holes when you start looking at these documents. And my son actually turned me on to a guy named Alan Green, who's a British researcher, and he has a channel on YouTube called The Bard Code, the Bard being Shakespeare. And what Alan Green is, he analyzes important works of art and important documents to understand if there is hidden meaning and important knowledge that may be encoded in those documents. Found this very fascinating. Started watching some of his 22-minute episodes of what he calls the America Codes. And in the America Codes, he breaks down this information about the Declaration of Independence, which was all new to me. And, I willingly went down that rabbit hole. So you can see there are two mistakes in this document, which is quite unusual for such an important document made with such beautiful calligraphy to have mistakes. And what Alan Green says is they're not mistakes, they're corrections. And what they're doing is they're changing the total number of characters in the document. And he claims that the total number of characters, when you include the symbols or the characters for the word only and the word representative, which is spelled wrong, you get to the number of 6,771 characters in total. Now, I don't just trust that when I hear it online. I want to check it. And of course, I'm not going to count the characters in the Declaration of Independence, but I could ask AI. And I said, can you get to that figure of 6,771 characters? And AI basically said you can if you exclude all the signatures, which is what Alan Green suggested, count the punctuation, but exclude the spaces. Okay, so when you do that, you get to 6,771 characters, which of course backwards is 1776. But right there, that's kind of intriguing on itself. Now, what Green is claiming in his research into these esoteric knowledge is that important scientific and mathematical information is encoded in these documents. So what could that be? That could be things like the distance to the moon. Well, first of all, let me point out the symbol for the A in America. Obviously, that's not an A. I mean, they could have chosen from many different types of calligraphic fancy A's and put an A there that none of us would mistake. But that's actually an esoteric symbol called the triple tap, which is three T's that are, joined at the base. And those represent the Trinity, Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. But also, according to Green, they represent the relationship between the sun, the moon, and the earth. And some of the relationships and distances that are encoded supposedly are distance to the moon, speed of sound, things like that. Now, if you take the distance to the moon in feet, it's 1.26 billion feet, 240,000 miles, which we confirmed yesterday is a lot of stone walls. So if you take that 1.26 billion feet and you divide it by 6,771, what you get is 186,000, which is the speed of light. Now, a couple of things you have to ask. Did they know the speed of light in that constant of 186,000 miles an hour or per second in 1776? And in fact, it was discovered in 1676. So right there, that's current relative scientific knowledge they wanted to put into an important document. And of course, the distance to the feet was calculated by Hipparchus in the 3rd century BC. So that also was an established number and constant that somebody found important enough to encode or apparently encode into the Declaration of Independence. So very, very fascinating and hooked me right away. It also turns out that Robert R. Livingston, as the Grand Master of the Lodge of New York, gave the oath of office to George Washington, placing his hand on the Masonic Bible from the New York Lodge. So really interesting stuff. A little, for some people, a little maybe out there, but I find it fascinating. I think it's really, really interesting. So I think I covered a lot of what I have written down here. I don't want to be redundant and explain things that have already gone on. Beyond the Masonic contributions, Livingston was a distinguished statesman, a drafter of the Declaration of Independence, an individual who administered, as I mentioned, the presidential oath of office to George Washington, a moment steeped in Masonic symbolism, reflecting his influence in both Masonic and national spheres. So what I find really interesting is leading up to the almost a catastrophe, leading up to the Revolutionary War, you had all these Masons and all these lodges, and what were they debating? These were intelligent individuals, and they were debating whether the country should, remain loyal to the king or whether they should become separatists and start their own country. and they debated it for a long time leading up to the revolution. They debated it very civilly, as you would expect. And of course, we know who won because all of the founding fathers of America are Masons, or nearly all of them. So I'm just going to run through some slides here showing what happens on the green in Woodstock as the sun rises, aligned with the roadway, illuminating the church steeple on the village green. So when I see patterns like this, I start looking around for what else might be a pattern. And when I looked at the orientation of the KTD monastery on the top of Overlook Mountain, it had the identical orientation to the church on the green, which is 122 degrees true, about 136, 137 on the compass. So I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. You have both the church in town there on the left, and the were built in 1799, and the the Tibetan monastery up on Overlook Mountain, actually the center of Tibetan Buddhism in the United States, has the exact same orientation. Ooh, wrong button. Okay, you can see 122, 122. And I actually know the engineer. I've done some work with the engineer, Mike North, who set up the KTD monastery in 1982. And I asked him why was it oriented that way? And basically he said, it's 1982, you expect me to remember? That's a long time ago. So he couldn't give me a clear answer, but I told him he got pretty lucky because the thing lines up perfectly with the winter solstice sunrise, which I think is very, very much intentional. So looking around for one more piece of that pattern, my own hometown, the Dutch Reformed Church in Hurley, New York, also a very old historic town, and Main Street, just like Main Street in Woodstock, also perfectly aligned to 122 degrees, the winter solstice sunrise. So to me, this is very telling. And of course, you have the Overlook Mountain site, which is also in Woodstock, right nearby. Both of these on Overlook Mountain is oriented to 122 degrees, the winter solstice sunrise. We have the Lenape have come up there, the Ramapo Lenape Turtle Clan. They've done their winter solstice sunrise ceremony because of all of the features of that site, not just oriented to Draco, but they're also oriented to the winter solstice sunrise on the horizon. So you really have a convergence in many ways of three traditions: the modern Masonic tradition, corresponding with the ancient Tibetan Buddhist tradition, corresponding with the Native American tradition of honoring these alignments in the winter solstice sunrise. So I think it's really an interesting phenomenon. I think that when we think of the Masons having an influence on great cities, I think we have to look much more locally. I think we can see this influence reflected right in our own towns and in some senses our own backyard. So I think we're on to the last part of this briefer that you folks are getting. And this has to do with Danskammer Point and me building on some of the research that I did at this site earlier on. I also have a chapter in my book on Danskammer and how it aligns with the mouth of the Wappingers Creek across the Hudson River for a perfect summer solstice sunrise, winter solstice sunset alignment. So I wanted to really understand who the chain of ownership, the chain of custody of that piece of land, and how it went from being an ancient Native American sacred landscape to a power plant, which is what it is today, unfortunately. So most historic rivers have had their shores, banks, points, and inlets well documented by researchers and those interested in understanding land use and property ownership throughout historic times. And of course, any stories river in America is much older than the towns and industries that have been established and recorded since Europeans arrived in mass in the late 17th century. One of the earliest, if not the earliest, documented land locations recorded in our region is Danskammer Point, along the west shore of the Hudson River, a little north of Newburgh, not really far from here. This timeline basically attempts to trace the property ownership of Danskammer Point, what Evan Pritchard says is called Gintkan Aki in Muncie, from when it first was identified as a Native American ceremonial site by Henry Hudson on his third voyage to discovery, seeking a northwest passage in September 1609 up through present time. And thanks to the work of previous researchers and the digital age we live in, resources are available for the layman to discover many details about the chain of custody, so to speak, of Danskammer Point. And the tools available for such an endeavor include newspaper archives, property cards, real county real property tax records, historical societies and their materials, and online services such as the Hackney Trust, among others. So according to tradition, the geographic location was originally named Dyval Danskammer in Dutch, the Devil's Dance Chamber in English, by the crew of the Half Moon on the evening of September 3rd, 1609, about a day's sail north of Manhattan. The ship passed a point of land where was witnessed a group of natives with their bodies painted, dancing around rings of fire. Second in command, Robert Jewett, made a note of the ship's log. And given the time of year, it's possible that this was the Lenape Green Corn Festival. Early September would make sense. And the Dutch sailors, being the good Protestant Calvinists, quickly labeled the activity they witnessed as devil worship. And it was about 1640 that that location name was publicly referred to as such by David Perez de Vries, and is still known as Danskammer Point to this day. So land ownership records are created, and land is bought and sold or handed down from generation to generation when transferred through inheritance. So to trace land sales and transfers, you must first track down the identity of landowners, land sellers, land buyers, and the associated transaction records. So many times it's an exercise in genealogy, discovering who married who gave birth, who passed on, and often these events were dictated, and or that these were the events that dictated sale, purchase, transfer, and bequeath, or inheritance, including wealth, debt, and property. And in general terms, land acquisition by Europeans began with kings granting land patents and manors to their agents in the field who worked on the crown's behalf, acquiring new territory. Manors were granted to individuals, think Livingston Manor. Patents were granted to groups of associates or business conglomerates, and land acquisition for grants and patents from local Native Americans was mostly accomplished through traditional means of pressure tactics with negotiations typically involving manipulation, intimidation, trickery, all in the name of gathering land and resources and conquest for the crown. It's interesting to note that the language still exists in the New York State Constitution that prohibits the forfeiture of lands originally acquired through manor and patent grants. So looking at who owned all this property, we have a parcel map, and basically I start at the present, and I'm going to work back, offering a narrative. There are multiple parcels which make up the Danskammer Point generating plant. Many have changed hand multiple times in recent years. However, the main parcel that makes up the point is still held by Central Hudson Gas and Electric. The 52-acre lot borders directly on the river. Some of the recent, somewhat convoluted transaction, including Danskammer parcels between 2001 and 2018, include Danskammer Energy is recorded in 2018 through present. Dans Energy sold the plant to Helios Power Capital in 2023, who in turn sold it to Mercuria Energy Group. Mercuria sold it to Tiger Infrastructure, a private equity firm based in Manhattan on Fifth Avenue. So the lot that makes up the point where the power plant is currently owned by Central Hudson. This is actually, I found in the Hathey Trust, a picture of the groundbreaking of 1949 of the plant and the steam generating plant at the time. So the listed ownership, Central Hudson, 1948 to present. Before that was Nancy Armstrong, 2015 to 2010. Was the most recent Armstrong to hold the property prior to Central Hudson. Some accounts say originally the land was given as a gift to Armstrong family from George Washington for the family's support during the Revolutionary War. So the matriarch of The oldest Armstrong was a Scottish officer in the British Army who negotiated the surrender of the British to Washington in Newburgh at the end of the war. So I think it's kind of interesting how his family ended up with all the land that is Danskammer, actually all the land from Royston in the south to Royal Bluffs, Cedar Bluffs in the north, about 2 miles of Hudson River frontage was given somehow was ended up being owned by the Armstrong family, who were on the losing side of the war. So it's kind of interesting. It's kind of maybe speaks to some of the spoils of war, and you can't help but wonder what the specific terms and details of the truce and surrender treaty between the Americans and British. And again, Colonel William Armstrong, who lived from 1750 to 1830, was a British officer, and he negotiated that surrender. So you gotta kind of wonder. Now, at the time that his son purchased the land in 1822, it had been in foreclosure. But you can't help wonder. Part of the civilized negotiations included the Armstrong family ending up with Danskammer and the surrounding farmlands, where the spoils of war being divvied up between parties. How did a British officer on the losing side end up with such valuable land? And it may never be known whether it was a gift from Washington or not. I did research with the Washington Historic Site in Newburgh and a lot of their archives, and nobody could really give me a clear answer. What were the circumstances in the terms of the foreclosures? Because Edward Armstrong, son of William, did in fact purchase it from foreclosure. Before that, we had, for a time, Danskammer Point was actually part of Ulster County. And in 1798, the southern portion of Ulster County became Orange County, kind of to even things out after the southern portion of Orange County became Rockland County. So you could call it the county lot line revision of 1798. Danskammer Point in the northern portion of the Harrison patent, which was the original land grant that included that land, was sold to Louis Moses Gomez. He lived from 1660 to 1740. He was an early Jewish settler who in 1716 purchased 1,200 acres of river frontage, expanded that to 3,000 acres in 1723, including Point. Jurian and Mackey acquired 600 acres of the patent from Susanna Bond, referred to as Dam's Corner, and Susanna Bond inherited from her father William Bond, Captain William Bond, who was one of the original 1714 George Harrison patent holders. So it kind of went from the Harrison patent to Bond, up through Gomez, up to, there was actually Wolvern Eckerd, who had it for a period of time around the Revolution, just before the Revolution, and then it fell into foreclosure. So it's kind of interesting that two different parties that held the land were not able to hold on to it. You know, so this was a Native American sacred site. Maybe it was holding on to itself in some way, not allowing it to be taken over by the European arrivals. Aside from a small indigenous collection at the New York State Museum in Albany, from Mary Butler Lewis, 1903 to 1970, America's first woman archaeologist, and taken directly from Danskammer Point, 82 records in total. But that's really all there is as far as archaeology from that site. There's not much else documenting it. And the diagnostics from Butler included an Orient fishtail projectile, 3,200 to 2,600 before present, a Lavana point, 700 AD to as late as 1350. There's also a couple of broken gun flints and a single pipe stem fragment. So other than the museum collection, any physical evidence of Native American presence on Danskammer Point has most likely long been obliterated by the industrial footprint of the modern era, the early American and colonial footprints that came before. Yet the site location itself and the location's relationship to the surrounding landscape and skyscape still stand in silent testimony to the Native American presence there. Additionally, to this day, some of the most fertile lands found anywhere lay on the upslope from Danskammer Point on the southeastern base farm fields and fruit orchards of Milton and Marlborough, which are quite productive. It's also been shown, that's what we'll finish up here, that the relationship from the point to the mouth of the Wappingers Creek has a relationship, and basically it lines up very much with where the sun rises on the longest day of the year, on the summer solstice. So if you run through Google Earth, you can see, I don't know if you can see it well enough, but you have the summer solstice, the sunset time, you have the degree 57, and that is nearly perfectly what Curtis Hoffman's chart shows for what you would expect the summer solstice sunrise to be at this latitude. Interesting enough, in that same point, at the evening of the summer solstice, what you have is the rise of Pleiades in that same location. It does that at different times during the night over the course of great periods of time. So here it's rising just after sunset, but it may rise in that same spot 1,000 years earlier or 1,000 points later at 2 in the morning or just before sunrise. And that is accounted for by the cycle of precession. Now, the reciprocal, you hear what you have is, it's hard to see, it's washed out, but you have the mouth of the creek here, point of land there, and what you have going on there on the winter solstice is an alignment with the sun setting. Opposite of the summer solstice sunrise would be the winter solstice sunset. And we see that here, a line between the mouth of the creek and the point of land. And then later in that same evening of the winter solstice sunset, you have a galactic alignment where the Milky Way comes down and aligns vertically with the horizon at that point where the sun set. So I think that's very interesting. And to use Doug Harris's phrase, which he was taught by his elders, let the landscape speak. And I think the evidence here is pretty strong that this is a strong or an important archaeoastronomy and landscape archaeology site that's been documented. So I don't think I left anything out on the timeline here. You know, it's hard to kind of see the pictures well, actually, it's not too bad. They're thinning things out. And this is all being done, in a sense, to make up and support Native American reconciliation and petition for redress, grievance with the state of New York. Now, the Akwesasne just had a big victory. It took them 30 years to get it, but they got land back up on the Mohawk, up on the St. Lawrence Seaway, that included an island that was transformed into a power plant. And part of their settlement that just occurred in the last week or so was they're now going to get money from the profits and proceeds and revenues from that power plant. So one of the things we have to ask is whether there's a land claim and an attempt at reconciliation, since the Lenape and the Wappingers and the people who were indigenous to those ancestral lands lost that point of land, that important point of land, without really any due process whatsoever. So we're looking to partner, and we've reached out to folks like the Native American Rights Fund, who provide lawyers to look at land claims and different other aspects of Native American legal processes that they have to go through. And it's not an easy thing, but we feel that the rightful people of that sacred site should really have some say in its future and also in what happened in the past. That finishes up that three-parter, and I thanks for your, basically, I always thank Nira for the opportunity, because I think mostly we all just want to share information that's important to us with people who care. So that's my conclusion.
Let's do a footprint. Potential let's do a footprint for look down Draco and
Can you hear that?
no,
No, he's here.
okay. So you mentioned this Draco in the north and denominator in the south, and other celestial alignments potentially for different mounds and sites. Does that extend also across the river, the other side? It seems like that's quite a big.
That's a very good question, and for sure, and Rob also alluded to this. It's one continuous landscape in many ways. This time it's like the dartboard, we're throwing darts at it, and there are these things everywhere. They're throughout the woods, throughout our region, throughout the Northeast, up and down the Appalachian corridor, both the east and west side. So I'd say it's all connected. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the features on the east side of the river relate to features on the west side. That's what we're asking.
So my understanding is the river, all I have to know what is away from but those who say that's saying.
Yeah, and that's been depicted. I think even the Egyptians show that the Nile relates to the Milky Way. So there is that as well.
I'm not ready for the point, though. The road would start, the line would be summer solstice, sunrise at one, right?
Winter solstice sunrise.
And the church at the end of that road, the facade faces directly.
Right.
And also the ridge line of the roof also lines up with that.
Yeah.
But the steeple, I have to tell you, every church steeple in the world, on every day of the year, is going to light up first before you see the sunrise. You can't count the steeple in that alignment.
I've had other people mention that to me, but at the same time, every steeple looks a little bit like the needle on a compass, if you think about it. I think many of them are directional, and the steeple is just an accoutrement to the building, and the building is oriented perfectly, and the steeple sits right on top of that orientation. So, but you're right. When the sun comes up, before it comes over the horizon, it's going to shine light on whatever is in its path. But I do think they built the steeples as the tallest point in town to catch that morning solstice light.
Okay.
Paul?
And that will
This doesn't reform church faces anyway.
The Dutch Reformed Church.
what's that?
Oh, yeah, both of them, both in Berkeley and in Woodstock. Well, my guess is that they were put in the early 18th century, they went to the Masons. Funding and the architecture was most. Oh, yeah, well, what most churches would do would get advice on architecture from the Masons, because that's what they did. Not the business team? Oh, indigenous. I don't think there's evidence of that necessarily. And that's why I was kind of puzzled about the orientation of the streets in Woodstock, because I didn't think it was an indigenous tradition, although you never know how the trails and the roads were originally set up. And of course, many roads did follow earlier indigenous trails. And of course, you do have the Overlook Mountain Lewis Hollow site, which is perfectly oriented in the same way to the winter solstice sunrise.
Pray right on anybody who has some specific project that they know about. The problem is the family you're trying to get some information about what is the how the project.
I don't know if he entered anything into the NEAR database and the site.db.org, but if you we can go in there and put in Craig Wright and see if anything comes up. I'm not sure.
Okay,
Thanks everyone.